The bullet that grazed her shoulder wasn't meant for her. But Penelope Reed had learned the hard way that intentions meant little when you were caught in the crossfire of someone else's war. She stumbled through the dusty streets of Rock Springs, Wyoming territory, clutching her bleeding arm, the late afternoon sun of August 1883 beating down mercilessly on her bare head. Her bonnet had been lost somewhere between the bank and wherever her feet had carried her in blind panic. The shooting had erupted so suddenly, a dispute over a card game spilling into violence, and she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Her vision blurred at the edges as she stumbled past the livery stable, barely registering the concerned shouts of the blacksmith. She had no money for a doctor, no friends in this town, no family anywhere in the world anymore. 3 weeks she'd been in Rock Springs, trying desperately to find work. Any work but respectable employment for a woman alone was scarce as rain in summer. The boarding house owner had made it clear this morning that without payment by week's end, she'd be on the street. Penelope's knees buckled just as she reached the edge of town, and she would have fallen face first into the dirt if strong hands hadn't caught her. Through the fog of pain and shock, she heard a deep voice, rough around the edges but somehow gentle. "Easy now. I've got you." She tried to focus on the face above her but could only make out a dark hat, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes that might have been green or gray. Then everything went black. When consciousness returned, Penelope found herself lying on something soft, staring up at unfamiliar rafters. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, and her shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She turned her head slowly and saw she was in a modest bedroom, clean and simply furnished. Her dress had been removed, replaced with a man's shirt that hung loose on her frame, and her shoulder was neatly bandaged. "You're awake." That same deep voice came from the doorway, and she looked over to see a tall man in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, watching her with cautious concern. He had dark hair that needed a trim, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and those eyes she'd glimpsed earlier were definitely green, the color of sage after rain. He held himself with a quiet strength, though something in his expression spoke of old sorrows carefully buried. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp. "My ranch, about 5 miles outside Rock Springs. Name's Gabriel Norton." He stayed in the doorway as if afraid coming closer might spook her. "Found you collapsing near the edge of town. Doc Patterson came out to look at you. Said you were lucky, the bullet just grazed you. Lost some blood, but you'll heal up fine." Penelope tried to sit up and Gabriel moved forward instinctively, then stopped himself. She managed to prop herself against the headboard, suddenly aware she was in a stranger's home, wearing his shirt, with no idea how she'd pay for the doctor's visit or anything else. "I'm Penelope Reed," she said, because manners persisted even in desperate circumstances. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Norton, but I should go. I can't pay you for the doctor or for your trouble. Didn't ask you to." He crossed his arms, leaning against the door frame. "And you're not going anywhere until you're steady on your feet. Doc said you need rest, proper food, and time to heal. Said you looked half-starved even before you got shot." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I've been managing fine." "Have you?" His tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. "When's the last time you had a decent meal?" She couldn't remember. 2 days ago. 3. She'd been rationing the last of her money, trying to make it stretch until she found work. Her silence answered his question. Gabriel sighed and uncrossed his arms. "Look, Miss Reed, I'm not trying to embarrass you. Times are hard, I understand that. But you're hurt, and you need time to recover. Stay here a few days at least. I've got a housekeeper who comes in during the day, so it's all proper. Consider it Christian charity if that makes it easier to accept." "I don't want charity." The words came out sharper than she intended, pride flaring even in the face of dire need. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding. "Then call it a business arrangement. I need help around here. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. She's getting on in years and the work's getting too much for her. She's been after me to hire someone to help with the cooking, cleaning, mending. You look like you could use work. Stay on, help out once you're healed up, and we'll call it even for the doctor and the room and board." Penelope studied him carefully, searching for any hint of ulterior motives. She'd learned to be cautious of men offering too good to be true opportunities. But Gabriel Norton's eyes were steady and honest, and something about the set of his shoulders spoke of bone-deep weariness rather than predatory interest. "Just housework?" she asked. "Just housework," he confirmed. "I run cattle, keep mostly to myself. Got a foreman and 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Chen comes up from town 6 days a week. It's all above board, Miss Reed. I'm just a rancher who could use reliable help, and you're someone who needs work. Seems like we could help each other out." It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd stumbled into Rock Springs 3 weeks ago. A job, room and board, a chance to save some money and figure out her next step. She'd be a fool to refuse, and Penelope Reed had been many things in her 22 years, but a fool wasn't one of them. "All right," she said quietly. "I accept, but I'll work for my keep from the start. Even while I'm healing, there must be mending I can do or something useful." For the first time, Gabriel's stern expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "We'll see what Mrs. Chen says. For now, just rest. I'll bring you some soup." He left before she could protest, and Penelope lay back against the pillows, her mind whirling. The room was simple but well kept, with curtains on the window and a braided rug on the floor. Through the glass, she could see rolling hills dotted with cattle and mountains rising in the distance under a vast sky. It was beautiful in a raw, untamed way. She closed her eyes, letting herself take a full breath for what felt like the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally turning over the next few days. Penelope learned the rhythms of the Norton Ranch. Mrs. Chen turned out to be a small, sturdy woman of about 60 with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She'd been widowed young and made her living keeping house for various families in and around Rock Springs. She spoke with a slight accent, her parents having immigrated from China to work on the railroads before settling in Wyoming. "Mr. Gabriel, he's a good man, Mrs. Chen told Penelope on the second day as she brought fresh bandages. "Sad but good. Lost his wife and baby daughter 3 years back. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Nearly broke him." Penelope's heart clenched. That explained the sorrow she'd glimpsed in his eyes, the careful way he held himself apart. "That's terrible." "He shut down after that," Mrs. Chen continued, her hands gentle as she changed the bandages. "Sold off most of the cattle, sent away the hands, kept only what he needed to survive. This last year he's been building back up, but he's different. Quieter. Doesn't go to town much, doesn't socialize. Just works from sunup to sundown like he's trying to outrun his grief." It made Penelope's own troubles feel smaller somehow, though no less real. She'd lost her parents to cholera 2 years ago, lost the small Kansas farm when she couldn't keep up with the bank payments, lost her fiancé when he'd decided a penniless orphan wasn't such a good match after all. She'd been drifting ever since, taking work where she could find it, slowly making her way west with some vague notion of starting fresh in California or Oregon. "He doesn't talk much," Penelope observed. "No, but he's always been a man of few words, even before." His wife Sarah, she was the chatty one, could talk the ears off a mule. Mrs. Chen smiled at the memory. They were good together. He grounded her, she lifted him up. The The light went out of him when she died. Penelope understood that kind of loss, though she'd never loved anyone the way Mrs. Chen described. Her engagement had been more practical than passionate, two people who got along well enough and thought they'd make a decent life together. When Robert had broken things off, she'd been hurt and angry, but not devastated. She wondered what it would feel like to love someone so deeply their loss could dim your whole world. By the fourth day, Penelope was up and moving around, her shoulder healing well. She insisted on making herself useful, starting with mending a pile of shirts and trousers that had been accumulating. Mrs. Chen seemed pleased to have the help and the company, and they fell into an easy partnership. Gabriel remained polite but distant, coming in for meals and then disappearing back to work on the ranch. He'd expanded his herd over the past year, Mrs. Chen explained, and was trying to build back what he'd lost. It was hard work for him and his small crew, and they were often out from dawn until after dark. One evening, about a week after Penelope's arrival, Gabriel came in for supper looking more exhausted than usual. His foreman, a weathered man named Jack Hayes, had mentioned they were trying to round up strays before the weather turned, and it was proving difficult with their limited numbers. Penelope had made a hearty beef stew with fresh bread, having taken over most of the cooking duties as her strength returned. She served Gabriel at the kitchen table, and he nodded his thanks, eating in his usual silence. "Mr. Norton," she ventured, taking a seat across from him with her own bowl. "Mrs. Chen mentioned you're short-handed for the roundup." He looked up, surprise flickering across his tired features. "We're managing. I grew up on a farm, I can ride, and I'm not afraid of hard work. If you need an extra set of hands, I could help." Gabriel set down his spoon, studying her carefully. "Your shoulder's barely healed. It's healed enough. And I'd rather make myself useful than sit around feeling useless." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that carefully maintained distance. "You're already useful, Miss Reed. The house hasn't been this well kept since." He trailed off, but she knew he meant since his wife died. "You don't need to prove anything." "Maybe I need to prove it to myself," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Penelope felt something stir in her chest, an awareness she hadn't expected. Gabriel Norton was a handsome man, there was no denying that, but it was more than his looks. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet integrity that called to something deep inside her. "All right," he said finally. "We head out at dawn. Wear something sturdy and bring a hat. It'll be a long day." The next morning, Penelope was up before sunrise, dressed in an old split riding skirt she'd modified from one of her dresses, and a work shirt Mrs. Chen had found for her. Gabriel raised an eyebrow when he saw her but didn't comment, just handed her the reins to a calm mare named Daisy. The day was everything he'd promised, long and hard and dusty. But Penelope loved it. There was something freeing about being out under the endless sky, working alongside Gabriel and his men to drive the scattered cattle back toward the main herd. She proved herself capable, and she could see Gabriel's respect for her growing as the day wore on. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the lunch Penelope had packed. Gabriel sat down beside her on a flat rock, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "You did good today," he said, and the simple praise warmed her more than it probably should have. "Thank you for giving me the chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cattle graze. Finally, Gabriel spoke again, his voice low. "Mrs. Chen told you about my wife." It wasn't a question. Penelope nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss. It was 3 years ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime." He turned his hat in his hands, not looking at her. "I thought I'd never care about anything again. Just kept working, kept existing, but not really living. "What changed?" Penelope asked softly. Gabriel looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt her breath catch. "I'm not sure yet, but something did." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until one of the hands called out that they needed to get moving again. Gabriel stood and offered Penelope his hand to help her up. His grip was warm and strong, and he held on just a beat longer than necessary before letting go. As summer faded into fall, Penelope settled into life at the Norton Ranch. She took over most of the household duties, insisting that Mrs. Chen deserved to slow down and enjoy her later years. The older woman still came by several times a week, more for the company than anything else, and Penelope treasured their friendship. But it was her growing connection with Gabriel that occupied more and more of her thoughts. He'd begun talking to her more, sharing stories of his childhood in Wyoming, his dreams for the ranch. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. Sometimes in the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, and the silence between them felt rich and full rather than empty. Penelope told him about her own past, the loss of her parents, her broken engagement, her struggles to find her place in the world. Gabriel listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard, truly seen, in a way she'd never experienced before. "Robert was a fool," Gabriel said one evening after she'd finished telling him about her former fiancé. "Letting you go. Maybe we both were fools, thinking we could build something on such a shaky foundation," Penelope replied. "We liked each other well enough, but there was no real feeling there, not the kind that lasts." "What kind is that?" She turned to look at him in the gathering dusk. "The kind where you can't imagine your life without the other person, where their happiness matters more than your own, where even the silence between you feels like a conversation." Gabriel's eyes were dark and intense in the twilight. "Yeah, that kind." The air between them seemed to crackle, and Penelope's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted him to kiss her, she realized. Wanted it with an intensity that surprised her. But Gabriel stood abruptly, mumbling something about checking on the horses, and the moment was broken. Penelope sat alone on the porch, her emotions in turmoil. She'd started to fall for Gabriel Norton, this quiet, wounded rancher who'd offered her work when she desperately needed it. But was he ready for something more? Was she? And what if she was reading everything wrong, seeing feelings that weren't really there? The next few days were awkward, with Gabriel seeming to avoid being alone with her. Penelope threw herself into her work, trying not to overthink things. She canned vegetables from the kitchen garden, made preserves, prepared the house for the coming winter. The Wyoming nights were already getting cold, frost touching the grass in the mornings. Then everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Gabriel had gone into Rock Springs for supplies, and Penelope was alone at the ranch house, the hands all out working. She heard riders approaching and went to the window, her stomach dropping when she saw 3 rough-looking men dismounting in the yard. She recognized the type. Drifters, maybe outlaws, the kind who preyed on isolated ranches. Her hand went to the rifle Gabriel kept by the door, and she was grateful he'd taught her to shoot a few weeks back, saying every woman living out here should know how to defend herself. The knock on the door was more of a pounding. Penelope took a deep breath and opened it a crack, the rifle held ready but not pointed. "Help you gentlemen," the leader, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking for Gabriel Norton. This his place. Mr. Norton isn't here. You can come back tomorrow. Maybe we'll just wait for him," the man said, pushing at the door. Penelope raised the rifle, her heart pounding but her hands steady. "Maybe you won't. This is private property and you're not welcome here. I suggest you ride on." The man's smile vanished. "That's no way to treat visitors, lady. You're not visitors, you're trespassers. Leave now, or I'll give you something to remember me by." For a tense moment they stared at each other. Then one of the other men spoke up. "Come on, Chet. Not worth getting shot over. We can catch up with Norton in town." Chet studied Penelope's face, seeming to reassess. Whatever he saw there made him step back. "You tell Norton that Chet Williams came by. We got business to discuss about that land parcel near Bitter Creek. Tell him it'd be in his best interest to sell." They mounted up and rode off, and Penelope finally allowed herself to breathe. Her knees were shaking, but she'd held her ground. She kept watch by the window until Gabriel returned an hour later, then met him outside to tell him what had happened. Gabriel's face darkened as she described the men. "Williams. He's been trying to buy up land all through this area, not always particular about his methods. What did he mean about Bitter Creek? I own a parcel up there with water rights. It's valuable, and Williams wants it to expand his operation. I've refused to sell." Gabriel looked at her with concern. "You shouldn't have faced them alone if they'd pushed harder." "But they didn't. I handled it." "You did," he agreed, something like pride in his eyes. "You surely did, but Penelope, if anything had happened to you—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you in danger because of me. I'm not made of glass, Gabriel. I can take care of myself. I know that, but—" He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "But I've lost too much already. I couldn't stand to lose you too." Penelope's breath caught. "Gabriel." "I've been fighting this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Telling myself it's too soon, that I'm not ready, that I have nothing to offer you but a half-rebuilt ranch and a broken heart. But the truth is, Penelope Reed, you've brought something back to life in me I thought was dead forever. You make me want to hope again, to believe in the future again, and that terrifies me." "Why does it terrify you?" she whispered. "Because what if I lose you like I lost Sarah? What if I let myself care, and then you're taken from me?" Penelope reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his stubble, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "We can't live our lives in fear of what might happen, Gabriel. I lost my parents, lost everything I thought my life would be, and I learned that the only thing we really have is this moment right now. And right now, I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm falling in love with you." He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm falling in love with you too," he said against her hair. "God help me, I am." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost tentative, like he was afraid she might break. But Penelope kissed him back with all the feeling she'd been holding in, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and urgent and full of promise. They broke apart finally, both breathing hard, and Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again." "Neither did I," Penelope admitted. "I didn't even know I could feel this way at all." "What do we do now?" he asked. "We take it one day at a time. We build something together, we let ourselves be happy." She smiled up at him. "Is that so hard to imagine with you?" "No." He kissed her again, softer this time. "No, it's not hard at all." The next few months unfolded like a dream. Gabriel and Penelope grew closer with each passing day, learning each other's rhythms, building a partnership that was both practical and passionate. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings, they'd sit together and make plans for the future. Chet Williams tried twice more to pressure Gabriel into selling, but each time Gabriel refused. The land was part of his legacy, part of what he wanted to build for the future, and he wasn't giving it up. Williams made vague threats, but nothing came of them, and eventually, he seemed to move on to easier targets. Winter settled over Wyoming in earnest, bringing snow and bitter cold. The ranch work slowed, and there was more time for quiet moments by the fire. Gabriel taught Penelope to play chess, and she taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud from a worn volume she'd carried all the way from Kansas. On Christmas Eve, as they sat together watching the snow fall outside, Gabriel took her hand. "I have something for you." He pulled out a small box and Penelope's heart began to race. Inside was a simple gold band, the kind meant for a wife. "It's not fancy," Gabriel said, suddenly nervous. "I know we haven't known each other that long, and if you want to wait—" "Yes," Penelope interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, Gabriel, I'll marry you." His whole face lit up with joy, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I love you, Penelope Reed. You came into my life when I'd given up on living, and you gave me back hope. You gave me back myself." "I love you too," she said, kissing him. "You offered me work when I needed it most, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a home. You gave me a future." They were married in Rock Springs on a cold January day in 1884 with Mrs. Chen as witness and half the town in attendance. Gabriel had more friends than he'd realized, people who'd watched him withdraw into grief and were happy to see him embracing life again. Penelope wore a dress Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, simple but beautiful, and Gabriel wore his best suit. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure, and Penelope felt a certainty deep in her bones that this was right. This was real. This was the life she was meant to live. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, and when they finally returned to the ranch, now truly their shared home, Gabriel carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests. "I'm starting as I mean to go on," he said, setting her down gently. "Taking care of you, loving you, making you happy." "Just love me," Penelope said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "That's all I need." Their wedding night was sweet and tender. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, choosing to trust in love despite all the reasons they had to be afraid. Gabriel was gentle with her, patient, making sure she felt cherished and safe. And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two halves of a whole finally united. Afterward, lying in Gabriel's arms in the darkness, Penelope felt a peace she'd never known before. This was what love was supposed to be. Not the tepid fondness she'd felt for Robert, but this consuming, all-encompassing feeling that made her certain she'd found her home. "Tell me what you're thinking," Gabriel said softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about how lost I felt when I stumbled into Rock Springs, how scared and alone, and now look at me." She tilted her head to smile at him. "I'm Mrs. Gabriel Norton, wife of the finest rancher in Wyoming, and I've never been happier." He kissed her forehead. "I was lost too. More lost than you, maybe, because I'd given up even trying to find my way. Then you came along, bleeding and stubborn and so damn brave, and you showed me there was still light in the world." "We saved each other," Penelope said. "Yeah, we did." Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle thrived, the range greened up after the winter snows, and Penelope discovered she was expecting a baby. She told Gabriel one evening in April, nervous about how he'd react given the tragedy he'd suffered before. But Gabriel's face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen on him. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby, we're having a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see he was. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He set her down carefully, his hand going to her still flat stomach. "I'm terrified too, I won't lie. But I choose to have faith. Faith in you, in us, in the future we're building." "That's all we can do," Penelope agreed. "Have faith and face whatever comes together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Penelope bloomed under Gabriel's attentive care. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she rested enough, ate well, didn't overwork herself. Mrs. Chen visited often, knitting tiny booties and sharing advice from her own long-ago motherhood. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Penelope went into labor. The doctor came from Rock Springs, and Mrs. Chen stayed by her side throughout while Gabriel paced anxiously downstairs. It was a long labor, painful and exhausting, but finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, a baby's cry filled the air. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, and Gabriel burst into the room, his face streaked with tears. Penelope held their son, exhausted but elated, and when Gabriel took the baby in his arms, she saw him transformed. All the old grief fell away, and he was simply a man holding his child, marveling at the miracle of new life. "He's perfect," Gabriel whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Gabriel's father, and he became the center of their world. Gabriel proved to be a devoted father, getting up for night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always soothed the baby. Penelope watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This was the man who'd been so broken by loss he'd nearly given up on life, now pouring all his love into this new little person. It was beautiful and humbling and everything she'd hoped for. As Thomas grew, the ranch prospered. Gabriel expanded the herd, hired more hands, and built a reputation as a fair employer and an honest dealer. People sought him out for advice, for partnerships, for friendship. The solitary, grieving man who'd offered Penelope work that day was gone, replaced by someone who engaged fully with life. Chet Williams tried one more time to buy the Bitter Creek parcel, offering a ridiculous sum. Gabriel refused again, and Williams finally gave up, moving his operations to Montana. The threat that had once loomed over them became just another memory. When Thomas was 2, Penelope found herself expecting again. This time a girl arrived with her mother's dark curls and her father's green eyes. They named her Sarah, after Gabriel's first wife, a gesture that felt right and healing. "She would have loved this," Gabriel said, holding baby Sarah while Thomas climbed into his lap. "She would have loved seeing me happy again, seeing the family we've built." "I wish I could have known her," Penelope said honestly. She'd never felt jealous of Gabriel's first wife, only grateful that he'd known love before and been willing to risk it again. "She would have liked you. You're different people, but you both have that same strength, that same fierce heart." He smiled at her. "I'm a lucky man to have been loved by 2 extraordinary women." The years rolled on, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. They added 2 more children to their family, another boy and another girl, until the ranch house rang with laughter and the chaos of childhood. Gabriel proved endlessly patient with his children, teaching them to ride, to work the ranch, to appreciate the land that was their heritage. Penelope sometimes looked back on that desperate, bleeding woman who'd stumbled into Rock Springs and marveled at how far she'd come. She'd been so lost, so alone, so certain she had nothing left to lose. But she'd been wrong. She'd had everything to gain if only she'd been brave enough to accept help when it was offered. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence in their lives until her death at age 78. She'd become like a grandmother to the children, and her loss was deeply felt. But she'd lived to see Penelope and Gabriel's happiness, had bounced great-grandchildren on her knee, and had died knowing she'd played a part in bringing 2 lonely people together. Gabriel's foreman, Jack Hayes, married a widow from town, and they built a house on the ranch property. Other families followed, until the Norton Ranch became almost a small community unto itself, people working together, supporting each other, building lives in the harsh but beautiful Wyoming landscape. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Gabriel and Penelope stood on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations. watching the sun set over mountains that had become as familiar as old friends. Their children were inside, the older ones helping the younger ones get ready for bed, and the sound of their voices drifted out through the windows. "Did you ever imagine this?" Gabriel asked, his arm around her waist. "When you first came here, hurt and scared and desperate?" "Never," Penelope admitted. "I was just trying to survive. I had no idea I was about to find everything I'd been looking for." "I thought my life was over," Gabriel said. "Thought I'd spend the rest of my years just going through the motions, existing but not really living. Then you showed up and everything changed." "We changed each other," Penelope corrected. "You gave me stability and safety when I needed it most. I gave you a reason to hope again. And together, we built all this." She gestured at the ranch, the home, the life they'd created. Gabriel turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes as green and intense as the day she'd first really looked at him. "I love you, Penelope Norton. More today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "My Gabriel. My home." They stood there as the sun disappeared and the stars came out, holding each other, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together. The bullet that had grazed Penelope's shoulder had led her to this porch, this man, this life. Gabriel's grief had kept him in Rock Springs instead of moving on after his loss. Every choice, every hardship, every moment of pain had been a step on the path to this perfect, imperfect, beautiful life they shared. Inside, their oldest son Thomas called out that the little ones were ready for their bedtime story. Gabriel and Penelope went in together as they did everything, partners in all things. They gathered the children, settled them into bed, and took turns reading from a battered storybook until young eyes grew heavy. Later, in their own room, Gabriel brushed out Penelope's hair like he did most nights, a simple intimacy they both cherished. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For stumbling into my life that day. For being brave enough to stay. For loving me even when I was too broken to believe I deserved it. For giving me all this." His hand swept out to encompass everything, their home, their children, their shared life. "Thank you for seeing me," Penelope replied. "For seeing past the desperate woman to who I really was. For offering me work when I needed it, yes, but more than that, for offering me a future. For trusting me with your heart even though it had been shattered. For building this life with me." They lay down together, fitting perfectly after all these years, and Penelope thought about hope. How easily it could be lost, how hard it was to reclaim, how precious it was when you found it again. Gabriel had thought his hope was lost forever, buried with his first family. But Penelope had offered it back to him, had shown him that grief didn't have to be the end of the story. And he'd done the same for her, really. She'd been adrift, hopeless, seeing no path forward. Gabriel had offered her work, yes, but he'd also offered her dignity, safety, and eventually, love. Together, they'd built something neither could have created alone. As sleep began to claim her, Penelope whispered, "I'd do it all again. Every hardship, every loss, every difficult step that led me here, because it led me to you." Gabriel's arms tightened around her. "So would I. Every moment of grief, every dark day, it was all worth it to find you." The Wyoming wind whispered around the house, the same wind that had blown Penelope into Rock Springs on a dusty August day so many years ago. But inside, wrapped in her husband's arms, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Penelope was home. Finally, completely, perfectly home. The years continued to be kind to them. The ranch prospered beyond Gabriel's hopes, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. When Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, Gabriel was invited to the celebration in Cheyenne, representing the ranchers of their region. He took Penelope with him, and they made a grand adventure of it, staying in a fine hotel and dancing at the statehood ball. "Look at us," Penelope laughed as Gabriel spun her around the floor. "A couple of humble ranchers rubbing elbows with politicians and businessmen." "Nothing humble about you," Gabriel replied. "You're the finest woman here." And she did look beautiful, in a dress of deep blue silk that brought out the warmth in her eyes. At nearly 40, she was even more lovely than she'd been as a desperate young woman, her beauty now grounded in confidence and contentment. Their children grew into capable, kind young people who loved the ranch as much as their parents did. Thomas, the eldest, showed a gift for managing cattle and eventually took over much of the day-to-day running of the operation. Young Sarah had her mother's way with numbers and helped keep the ranch books. The younger two, Daniel and Emma, were still finding their paths, but Gabriel and Penelope gave them the freedom to explore their interests. When Thomas announced his engagement to a teacher from Rock Springs, a lovely young woman named Catherine, Gabriel and Penelope hosted the wedding at the ranch. It was a grand affair, with people coming from across the state, and as Gabriel watched his son take his vows, he reached for Penelope's hand. "Our boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our blessing," Penelope agreed, squeezing his hand. "All of them are." They became grandparents the following year, and then again and again as their children married and started families of their own. The ranch house that had once been so quiet, inhabited only by a grieving widower, now rang constantly with the sounds of life. Grandchildren underfoot, daughters-in-law helping in the kitchen, sons-in-law working the range alongside Gabriel. On quiet evenings, when the house finally emptied out and it was just the two of them again, Gabriel and Penelope would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, as they'd done for decades now. "Did we do good?" Gabriel asked one such evening when he was nearing 60 and Penelope was in her mid-50s. "We did wonderful," Penelope assured him. "Look at what we built, Gabriel. Not just the ranch, though that's impressive enough, but the family, the love, the legacy. Children and grandchildren who know they're cherished, who have a place they belong, who understand the value of hard work and honest dealing." "You did that," Gabriel said. "You brought love back into this house." "We did it together," Penelope corrected, as she always did. "Partners, remember." "Partners," he agreed, pulling her close. "Always." As they grew older, they grew even closer, if that was possible. They'd weathered storms together, both literal and metaphorical. Droughts that threatened the herd, harsh winters that tested their resolve, the normal trials of raising children and running a large operation. But they'd faced it all together, and each challenge overcome had only strengthened their bond. Gabriel's hair went silver, and Penelope's developed threads of white through the dark. Lines appeared on their faces, testaments to years of sun and laughter and hard work. But when Gabriel looked at his wife, he saw only beauty. And when Penelope looked at her husband, she saw the man who'd saved her life in more ways than one. They made it a tradition to retell their story to the grandchildren, how Grandma had stumbled into town hurt and lost, and Grandpa had found her and brought her home. The children loved the romance of it, the drama of gunfights and desperate circumstances and love blooming against all odds. "Tell about when Grandpa proposed," little Emma, named for her aunt, would beg. And Penelope would tell about the Christmas Eve, the snow falling, the simple ring that she still wore every day. The children would sigh happily, and Gabriel would catch Penelope's eye and smile, both of them remembering that moment, the leap of faith it had required. "Tell about when I was born," Thomas's oldest boy would demand, and Gabriel would launch into the story, making it sound like the greatest adventure ever undertaken. These were the richest years, Penelope often thought. When you could look back on a life well lived and look forward to watching your legacy continue into the future. When you had a partner who knew every corner of your heart and loved you all the more for it. When you'd built something that would outlast you, would carry on when you were gone. She said as much to Gabriel one spring evening as they watched their grandchildren playing in the yard, their own children supervising. "I used to think happiness was something dramatic," she mused. "Something that hit you like lightning and changed everything in an instant. And maybe it was, that day you found me. But real happiness, the kind that lasts, it's this. It's quiet evenings and family gathered and knowing you've built something good." Gabriel nodded, understanding as he always did. "I thought I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. Thought God only gave you one shot at a good life, but I was wrong. I got a second chance and I thank heaven for it every day." "We both got second chances," Penelope said. "The universe knocked us down, but it also put us in each other's path. I choose to believe that was intentional, that we were meant to find each other." "I believe that too," Gabriel agreed. Two broken people becoming whole together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, and the land they'd worked so hard to build up spread out around them. This was home. This was love. This was the life Penelope had never dared dream of when she'd been stumbling through Rock Springs, bleeding and desperate. And it all started because a rancher had offered her work, and she'd offered him hope he thought he'd lost forever. When Gabriel was 65 and Penelope 62, they decided to officially turn the ranch over to Thomas, though they still lived in the main house and helped out when needed. It was time, they agreed, to let the next generation take the reins while they enjoyed a slower pace. They took a trip together, something they'd always talked about but never done, traveling by train to San Francisco to see the ocean. Penelope had never seen the Pacific, and Gabriel wanted to give her that experience. They stayed in a hotel overlooking the bay, took long walks on the beach, and marveled at how far they'd come from that dusty Wyoming ranch. "You ever miss it?" Gabriel asked as they watched waves crash against the shore. "The excitement of those early days, the uncertainty," Penelope laughed. "Not for a second. I'll take our quiet, peaceful life over uncertainty any day, though I'll admit falling in love with you was the greatest adventure I ever had." "Still is," Gabriel said, pulling her close. "Every day with you is an adventure." They returned home rejuvenated, ready to enjoy this new phase of life. Gabriel taught his grandsons to work leather and wood, passing on skills he'd learned from his own father. Penelope taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, but also to read widely and think independently, preparing them for a changing world where women were beginning to have more opportunities. The 20th century arrived, bringing changes even to their remote corner of Wyoming. Electricity came to Rock Springs, though the ranch still relied on lamps and fire. Automobiles began appearing, strange mechanical beasts that spooked the horses. The world was transforming, but some things remained constant: the land, the work, the value of family and love. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a grand party. People came from all over Wyoming, friends and neighbors and business associates, all gathering to celebrate the couple who'd become something of a legend in the region. The rancher who'd lost everything and the desperate woman he'd saved, building an empire of love and family and honest work. Gabriel stood to make a toast, and the room fell quiet. 30 years ago," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "I married the woman who saved my life. I thought I was the one doing the saving, finding her hurt and offering her work. But the truth is, Penelope saved me. She gave me back hope when I'd lost it. She gave me back the ability to love, to dream, to believe in the future. Everything good in my life stems from that moment when I caught her as she fell. And I'd do it again, every time, for all eternity. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and Penelope was crying openly as Gabriel raised his glass. To my wife, my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. Thank you for 30 years. Here's to 30 more. To 30 more, everyone echoed, and the party continued late into the night. But of course, 30 more years wasn't to be. They were only human, after all, subject to the same mortality as everyone else. Gabriel's health began to fail when he was 70, his heart growing weaker. The doctor said it could be years or it could be months. There was no way to know. Gabriel faced his declining health with the same quiet strength he'd brought to everything in life. He made sure all his affairs were in order, that Thomas knew everything about running the ranch, that each of his children and grandchildren knew how much he loved them. "I'm not afraid," he told Penelope one evening as they sat together in their room. "I've had a full life, more happiness than most people ever know, and I'll have you by my side until the end. What more could a man ask for? You could ask for more time," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "I'm not ready to lose you." Gabriel took her hand, pressing it to his chest where she could feel his heart beating, irregular but still strong. "You'll never lose me. I'll be in every sunset you watch from our porch, every laugh of our grandchildren, every acre of this land we built together. Death can't take that away." "It can take you from my arms," she whispered. "Then we'd better make the most of the time we have left," he said, pulling her close, and they did. They savored every moment, every touch, every conversation. Gabriel grew weaker, but his mind stayed sharp, and his love for Penelope never wavered. He told her daily how much he loved her, how grateful he was for every day they'd had together. On a warm September evening, with the windows open to let in the breeze, and his family gathered around, Gabriel Norton passed peacefully from this world. He died as he'd lived the second half of his life, surrounded by love, holding Penelope's hand. The grief was crushing. Even knowing it was coming didn't prepare Penelope for the reality of life without Gabriel. The man who'd been her partner for over 30 years, who'd given her everything, was gone. The house felt empty despite being full of family. The bed felt cold despite the warm autumn nights. But Penelope had learned something about grief from watching Gabriel survive his first wife's death. It was survivable. It was devastating and painful and sometimes felt like it would swallow you whole, but it was survivable. And she had so much to live for: children, grandchildren, the ranch, the legacy she and Gabriel had built together. She mourned deeply but not hopelessly. She let herself feel the pain but didn't let it consume her. And slowly, day by day, she found a new normal. A life without Gabriel physically present but still full of his influence, his love, the mark he'd left on everything around her. Thomas and his brothers made sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be. Her daughters visited often. The grandchildren kept her busy and brought light into dark days. And she found comfort in the rhythms of the ranch, the work that had to be done regardless of grief, the land that endured beyond any individual life. On what would have been their 35th anniversary, Penelope sat on the porch alone, watching the sunset. She wore her wedding ring, as she always would until her own dying day, and she could almost feel Gabriel sitting beside her. "We did good, didn't we?" she said aloud to his memory. "We took our second chances and we made something beautiful. I miss you every moment of every day, but I'm grateful. Grateful for every second we had, every kiss, every laugh, every sunrise and sunset we watched together. You offered me work that day, Gabriel Norton, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." The wind whispered through the grass, and a hawk circled overhead, and Penelope felt a peace settle over her. Gabriel was gone, but their love remained, woven into the fabric of this place, this family, this life they'd created together. She lived another 10 years, staying active and engaged with the ranch and her growing family. She met great-grandchildren, saw the ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's careful management, and watched the world change in ways she could never have imagined as a young woman. When Penelope Reed Norton passed away at the age of 72, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last words were, "Tell Gabriel I'm coming home." They buried her next to Gabriel on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Penelope Reed Norton, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She brought hope to a broken heart and love to a lonely home." And beside Gabriel's stone, which read, "Gabriel Norton, devoted husband and father who found love twice and treasured it always." The ranch continued on, passed down through generations, each one adding to the legacy. And always, the story was told of how it all began, with a wounded woman stumbling into town and a grieving rancher who offered her work. How she'd offered him hope he thought he'd lost forever. How together, they'd built something that would last long after they were gone. Their great-great-grandchildren still work that land, still live in the house Gabriel built and Penelope made a home. The porch where they sat and fell in love still stands, weathered by time but sturdy. And on summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and red, it's easy to imagine them there still. Two souls who found each other against all odds, who loved deeply and built well, who proved that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. In Rock Springs, in the small cemetery behind the church, their graves are tended by descendants who never knew them but know their story by heart. And sometimes, visitors come, drawn by the legend of the rancher and the woman he saved, who in turn saved him. They stand before those twin headstones and think about love, about hope, about second chances. Because that's what Gabriel and Penelope's story really is. A testament to the power of second chances, to the resilience of the human heart, to the way two broken people can come together and create something whole and beautiful and enduring. The rancher offered her work when she desperately needed it. She offered him hope he thought he'd lost forever. And together, they built a love story for the ages, one that continues to inspire everyone who hears it, reminding them that it's never too late to start over, to love again, to believe in the possibility of happiness. Their story lives on in the land they loved, in the family they created, in the lives they touched. It lives on in every sunset watched from that old porch, in every couple who finds each other against the odds, in every heart that dares to hope again after loss. And if you listen closely on a quiet Wyoming evening, when the wind whispers through the grass and the stars come out over the mountains, you might almost hear them still. Gabriel and Penelope, partners and lovers and best friends, together for all eternity in the land, and the legacy they built with their own hands and hearts. This is their story. A story of loss and redemption, of grief and healing, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built a life that mattered. A story that proves love is always worth the risk, always worth the effort, always worth believing in. And it all started with a simple act of kindness. A rancher seeing someone in need and offering help, never knowing that helping her would be the thing that saved him too.